Gendry Baratheon stood in the courtyard of the Red Keep, feeling the warmth of dawn's early light on his cheeks, uncertain whether the sudden pounding of his heart signaled elation or fear. The city beyond the keep's walls was still waking, the hush of morning broken by distant shouts of vendors and the shuffle of hooves along stone roads. It had been weeks since the Grand Council, convened in the aftermath of war and strife, had all but demanded that he, a low-born blacksmith's apprentice turned recognized bastard, claim the Iron Throne in the name of House Baratheon. Yet even as the crown rested on his brow, he could scarcely believe it was real. He glanced down at his hands, still calloused from years of labor at the forge, and wondered how these hands had found themselves decorated with rings of gold rather than the grit of steel filings. He still felt the phantom weight of a hammer, the heat of a smithy's coals, the coarse shuffle of leather aprons against his chest. In his mind those days were better, simpler. He had labored hard, bent over an anvil in Flea Bottom, oblivious to the swirling politics that surrounded the bastard of Robert Baratheon. Now every breath he took felt loaded with significance. So many eyes watching, waiting, measuring. He once told Arya Stark he did not want to be a lord. Yet here he was, made king. Despite his father's legacy, despite the storms of war that had torn Westeros to pieces, there was a sense that this new era could be different. While no man had openly questioned Gendry's birthright since the lords gathered to put him on the throne, given every other viable line had been devoured by chaos, betrayal, or dragons, there was still an undercurrent of skepticism among certain factions. Gendry could sense it in the bowed heads of some highborn lords, in the way their eyes flicked up at him with doubt, perhaps even scorn. What right did a bastard have to rule them all? That question seemed to linger in the air, more real to Gendry than the newly forged crown upon his head. Even so, he had begun his reign with a certain measure of caution and humility. He told himself he was no politician, no statesman, no cunning spider weaving webs of intrigue. He was a blacksmith given power by chance and blood. But perhaps a king who did not play the old games could do better by the realm. That was Gendry's secret hope, that he might forge a new order in Westeros, one that did not crush the small folk beneath the weight of ancient houses and stale traditions. His first days on the throne had been consumed by ceremony and speeches, by envoys seeking favor. There had been half a dozen grand feasts orchestrated by the Master of Revels, once a minor clerk who had scrambled to fill the gap left by the departed royals, and Gendry hated them all. He recalled in fleeting moments the simpler tastes of brown bread and the watery ale he once shared with Arya in a cramped holdfast. But he swallowed his discomfort as best he could, and tried to do what was expected of a new king, to look regal, to speak with gentle authority, and to display the courtesy that so many noble lords demanded. This particular morning, he stood at the edge of the courtyard, because he had ordered a demonstration of arms from the city watch. He wanted to see the men who policed King's Landing for himself, to sense whether they served the people or merely the interests of the crown. The gold cloaks marched in formation before him, shining spears angled toward the sky, and Gendry caught a glint of reflection in their helms. As a blacksmith, he could appreciate the craft that had gone into each piece of armor, though a part of him wondered how many sets were ill-fitting or cheaply made, cutting corners to line some officer's pocket. He stepped forward, the crown on his head feeling foreign and too heavy, and gestured for the commander to approach. The stout man bowed, his broad face shining with perspiration. Gendry asked him direct questions about his men's training, wages, and discipline. To the commander's credit, he responded confidently, without stumbling. But there was hesitation in his eyes. Gendry could see it. The man had not yet grown accustomed to a king who asked for specifics about rations and pay. Kings typically left such matters to their council. It had been only a month since that day when the remaining lords of Westeros had gathered, those from the Reach, the Vale, the North, the Stormlands, and Dorne, to determine the fate of a realm battered and bled by so many wars. The name of Gendry Waters had come up hesitantly at first. He recalled the words of Davos Seaworth, that plain-spoken knight who had once plucked him from the jaws of the Red Woman's fire. Davos had vouched for him, reminding everyone present of how Robert Baratheon had been a liberator once, how he himself had toppled a tyrant. That was a romantic memory for many. though the truth of Robert's rule was complicated. Yet, with the Targaryen line seemingly in tatters and half the great houses crippled beyond recognition, Gendry's claim had stood out like a bolt of lightning in a thunderstorm. A symbol of the storm king returned, some called it. And so they crowned him. Now, he wore that burden like a chain around his neck. The demonstration ended, the gold cloaks dispersing to their posts with a disciplined step. Gendry thanked the commander and turned away, heading through the courtyard's archway to the private corridor that led into the heart of the Red Keep. Sir Podrick Payne, one of his newly appointed Kingsguard, followed dutifully at his side. Podrick's expression seemed as earnest as ever, young but determined. They passed tapestries of great battles and heroic figures from past generations. Gendry paid them little mind. His own father, King Robert, was depicted in one of them, clutching a warhammer spiked with rubies, a triumphant grin on his bearded face as he stood over the corpse of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. But Gendry did not see a glorious hero there. He saw only a man whose violent triumph had paved the way for more violence and the eventually fracturing of the realm. It haunted him how cyclical war had become in Westeros, each fresh conflict rooted in old injustices and the thirst for power. In his private solar, Gendry cast off his crown onto a cushioned chair, running a hand through his dark hair. The windows were open to the sea breeze, and the salt-laden wind offered a small comfort. From this vantage, he could see the Blackwater Bay stretching out before him, calm and glimmering. The city curled along the coast, a sprawl of dense rooftops where thousands, if not millions, of common folk went about their lives. He wondered how many realized that a king now sat upon the throne who had once been one of them. More importantly, he wondered what he could do to truly help them. In the decades and centuries of Westerosi history, the small folk had always been trampled by the highborn, used as pawns in wars, or starved by harsh winters. Gendry had spent most of his life being a nobody in that swarm, a bastard scraping for food and a place to sleep. He remembered the hunger pangs, the casual cruelty that lords or ladies, or even hedge knights might inflict upon him. He remembered the cost of living in Flea Bottom. Now he was a king, by all the gods, and he intended to do something radical. The mere thought of it, that he might break an order that had stood for centuries, made his heart flutter with both excitement and dread. In those early days, he called upon friends and advisors he trusted, Sir Davos, Brienne of Tarth, even some pragmatic minds from among the new generation of lords, such as Edric Storm, who was also a bastard of House Baratheon, recognized by Robert in his final years. Gendry welcomed the man into his council, forging a strange kinship that was bolstered by their shared father, though they had once been as distant as opposite sides of the realm. He also wrote letters to the north, seeking counsel with Sansa Stark, the Lady of Winterfell, for if any highborn survivor understood the plight of the small folk as well as Gendry did, it was the Starks. Arya Stark, however, was away on her own voyages, exploring uncharted waters beyond the edge of the map. He found himself longing for her presence, for that frank and fearless spirit who had once told him she would never be anyone's lady. There was a pang of regret that he'd never truly said goodbye to her. But he pushed that aside. He was king now, and sentiment had to take second place to duty. As the weeks passed, Gendry's plan began to take shape. It was a mad dream, but one he could not chase out of his mind. The nobility of Westeros had caused untold suffering. The realm's system of feudal obligations forced the small folk into a life of near servitude, locked in loyalty to great houses that rarely cared whether peasants lived or died. War after war had proven that noble houses fought for their own claims with a callous disregard for the common people. If Gendry had any power at all, if the crown could do something meaningful, it would be to shatter that old cycle. And so the question began to burn in him. What if, as king, he dissolved the great houses entirely, or at least stripped them of the power that had caused so much harm? He had no illusions it would be easy. The houses were ancient and proud. Many had genealogies stretching back thousands of years. Some boasted the blood of the first men, the Andals, the Valyrians. They clung to their traditions like drowning men to driftwood. But Gendry saw tradition had yielded only chaos and bloodshed. He would not start a new war lightly, yet if it came to that, he had to be prepared. The question he wrestled with every night was whether such a transformation could be done peacefully. But the more he studied, the more he listened to Davos' wise counsel, the more he realized that to remove the great houses from power, or to drastically weaken their hold, might require a confrontation that would make the War of Five Kings look tame. One evening, he summoned Davos, Brienne, and Podrick to his private solar. The windows were shuttered for secrecy, and the only light came from flickering candles arranged on the table. Outside, the night sky was thick with stars. Gendry could hear the murmured activity of the Red Keep's guards, but the solar itself was hushed, sealed off from prying ears. The gravity of the gathering was evident on everyone's face. He spoke to them plainly, as a blacksmith would. What would happen, he asked, if I decreed that the titles of all great houses are dissolved? No more House Lannister, House Tarly, House Tully, or House Tyrell. No more House Baratheon even. He paused, swallowing thickly, as he realized he was threatening his own family name. What little there was of it. What if I made it so that from this day forth, all are free men and women of Westeros, beholden not to a lord but to the crown, under new laws that protect every person's rights? Brienne, tall and stoic, looked taken aback. She had always been loyal to the idea of honor, of vows. She had served in the name of Stark, Tarth, and even the Seven Kingdoms. Now Gendry was proposing something that would uproot the entire concept of noble houses. She folded her arms across her chest, gaze thoughtful. "Your Grace," she said, her tone careful, "the houses will resist such a sweeping change. Families have carved out dominion over their lands for centuries. They're not likely to simply relinquish it." Davos gave a low sigh, rubbing the stubble on his chin. "It's a bold idea," he said. "But the small folk might rally to you, if they see a chance at freedom from taxes and abuses. Yet the lords have armies and gold. They can make life difficult, Your Grace." Podrick stood quietly in the corner, blinking. He was no politician, and the swirl of such revolutionary notions seemed to overwhelm him. But he found his voice, softly. I think the realm could benefit from it, if it can be done without causing more suffering." Gendry leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I spent my life in Flea Bottom, hammered steel in a sooty forge, and saw men and women starve because some high-born lord thought raising taxes was an easy way to fund his next tournament. I don't want to be another king who turns a blind eye to the plight of the people. I want to break the wheel, as Daenerys Targaryen once claimed she would." He paused, a strange shiver passing through him at the memory of the Dragon Queen, who had come so close to shaping the realm in her own image. He remembered hearing stories of her final days, of how she had been undone by her own rage and illusions. "I don't want to become a tyrant," he said quietly. "But we can't go on as we did before." Silence reigned for a time. Brienne finally nodded. "If this is what you wish to do, then you will need loyal allies and a plan. You'll need a way to ensure the lords don't unite against you. The North might be more receptive, given Lady Sansa's empathy for her people. Dorne might be stubborn, but they're so exhausted from war they may not immediately rebel if they see something to gain. But the Reach, the Vale, the Westerlands, these are proud territories, fiercely protective of their feudal rights." Davos added, "We'll need to meet with them. If we can show them that peace and prosperity will follow, perhaps we can avoid another war. But I won't lie, lad. This is a risky gamble." Gendry took a deep breath. "I was never meant to be king. Yet here I am. Let it not be said I let this chance pass by out of fear." The next day, Gendry began laying out the foundation of what he called the Charter of Common Freedoms. He summoned quills and parchment, scribbling in his barely legible script until Davos and a handful of learned scribes took over to make the language clear. The charter, in essence, declared the dissolution of hereditary lordships. It stated that the land of Westeros belonged equally to all who dwelled upon it, and though local governance would remain, it would no longer be tied to noble birth. Instead, each region would choose its own council or representatives, who would meet with the King's Council in King's Landing to address matters of taxation, law, and security. A radical notion indeed, and one that might upend everything. Rumors began to swirl through the corridors of the Red Keep before Gendry even finished drafting the charter. Servants whispered that the new king meant to cut off the heads of all the lords. Merchants fretted that he would seize their property. Sellswords boasted that they might find new employment in the wars that would surely come. Gendry felt the tension building, a coil ready to spring. He decided to unveil his plan slowly. First, he sent riders to the major lords, requesting their presence at a grand council in King's Landing 3 months hence. He couched it in terms of needing to rebuild the realm after the last conflicts, hoping that the lords would come at least out of curiosity or a sense of duty. In the meantime, Gendry took steps to ensure the city itself was well provisioned, so that famine or plague would not spark a riot before the council even began. He worked with the Master of Coin to reduce certain duties on essential goods, freeing up more grain and vegetables to flow into the city. Common folk, at least for a moment, saw a small improvement in their daily lot, and talk of the blacksmith king spread through taverns and markets. Some rumored that Gendry walked among them at night, in disguise, listening to their concerns, though whether that was true or simply an echo of the stories about Denris days in Essos was unclear. As the weeks rolled on, the lords arrived in King's Landing. Some arrived in regal processions, banners flying, armor gleaming. Others came more humbly, or with only a handful of guards, suspicious of traps and further violence. The city braced for their presence. Alongside them came petty lords, merchant princes, hedge knights, envoys from the free cities. The capital had not seen such a congregation since the tourney of the hand, decades ago. Gendry watched it all from a high balcony, flanked by Brienne and Podrick. He saw the banners of House Frey, what was left of them, drifting by, ironically disdained by the crowds below. He saw the golden line of Lannister, carried by a distant cousin of that once powerful house. He saw the trout of Tully, the falcon of Arryn, the direwolf of Stark, the stag of Baratheon. They came, not to celebrate a wedding or a coronation feast, but to hear what this new king, this blacksmith-turned-monarch, intended to do. It struck Gendry just how precarious his position was. If even half of these lords turned against him, he would be facing an alliance that might overshadow the War of 5 Kings. He prayed to whatever gods might still listen that he would find the words to convince them of his vision. The Grand Council convened in the throne room, though Gendry had taken to calling it the Hall of the Crown, in an attempt to distance himself from the throne's bloody legacy. The Iron Throne itself, twisted metal hammered from the swords of conquered foes, still loomed at the far end. Gendry kept the dais but placed a more modest seat there, wanting to appear neither too eager to display power nor too timid. The lords and ladies gathered in the hall. The tension in the air was palpable. Gendry rose and addressed them, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. He spoke of the wars that had racked the 7 kingdoms, of the endless cycles of vengeance and ambition. He spoke of how the small folk suffered, and of how the realm could not endure another generation under the same system that had caused so much strife. Then, with his heart pounding in his chest, he laid out the Charter of Common Freedoms. The murmurs in the hall turned to gasps, then a rising wave of outrage as some lords shouted. Cries of treason and madness echoed. Gendry could see the red flush on the face of certain high-born men, while others stood in stunned silence. A few from the Vale and the North looked thoughtful, perhaps even intrigued, but the majority were scandalized. Lord Gamlen Lannister, a rotund man with a keen eye for court intrigue, stepped forward to speak. "Your Grace," he began, voice dripping with formal courtesy, "surely you must realize the impropriety of dissolving houses that have stood since the Age of Heroes. This is an affront to the natural order, an offense to the gods. The crown's authority itself stands on the foundation of noble blood. If you unmake that, you unmake your own throne." A few lords nodded vigorously. Gendry took a breath, remembering Davos' words. "Be calm, let them speak, then reason. My own claim to the throne rests on blood." "Yes," Gendry said, "but I do not want that to be the basis of my rule. I do not believe anyone should inherit a crown or a seat of power simply because their father or mother held it. I intend to remain king, so long as I serve the people. And should I fail? That caused fresh outrage, as if the concept of removing a king who did not serve the realm was somehow more horrifying than constant war. But Gendry pressed on. He described how he would create councils for each region, how farmland and resources would be distributed, how the crown would levy taxes fairly to maintain roads, keep the peace, and feed the hungry. He laid out a vision of a realm where power was not confined to a handful of families, but spread among all who lived in Westeros. It was a utopian dream, and he felt the weight of centuries of tradition pushing back against him. Lord Jan Royce of the Vale, wearing a thick bronze breastplate covered in runes, spoke up. "Your Grace, you must see that this is impossible to implement overnight. How will the Vale select these representatives you speak of? By popular vote? By appointment from a council of knights and landed gentry? What of inheritance laws? If we strip titles, do we also strip laws of succession for property and land?" Battery. Gendry exhaled. He had anticipated such questions, but the scale of them threatened to drown him. "We will address these matters one by one," he said. "I do not propose chaos. Rather, I propose an orderly transition, guided by a new set of laws that ensure fairness. I'm not fool enough to think it will happen tomorrow. But we must begin." "No," Lord Lannister sneered. "It is madness, and I will not stand for it. The Westerlands remain loyal to the throne, but not to this lunacy." Gendry locked eyes with the man. "That is your choice," he said. "But I would urge you to consider the cost of continuing the old ways. Another war will bleed us all. Is that truly what you desire?" The hall erupted into debate, voices clashing, until Gendry finally called for order. He proposed that the lords remain in the city for a fortnight to discuss and debate the plan. He gave them private quarters, arranged feasts that were simpler than the lavish affairs of old, but still generous. He encouraged them to wander the city, to speak with the small folk themselves if they dared. He wanted them to see the possibility of a realm that cared for its own. In the days that followed, Gendry met privately with as many lords and ladies as he could, attempting to win them over, or at least soften their resistance. Davos worked tirelessly by his side, smoothing tensions with that plain-spoken courtesy that had once earned him the nickname, the Onion Knight. Brienne's presence was a reminder of loyalty and honor unbound by birth. Edric Storm, for his part, visited taverns in Flea Bottom and brought back stories of how the common folk were elated by Gendry's radical talk, even if they feared the retribution of the lords. Slowly, some of the smaller houses began to shift in their stance. They had been overshadowed by the great houses for so long that the promise of a system where they would have equal voice was tempting. A few of the newly emerging lords, those who inherited titles after the wars and were still unsure of their hold, also saw an opportunity in a realm that did not revolve around bloodlines. But the powerful and ancient houses remained staunch in their opposition. Late one evening, Gendry sat in his solar, too tired to remove his crown or the heavy robes he had worn all day. He stared at the dying embers in the hearth. The door opened quietly, and Davos stepped in. The old knight's face was lined with exhaustion, but he managed a small nod of greeting. "How does it look?" Gendry asked, his voice ragged. Davos sighed. "We're making some progress, lad, but it's fragile. Lord Lannister is gathering a faction against you. He's got the support of some wealthy lords who don't want their mines and trade routes turned over to a council." Gendry clenched his jaw. "I won't back down on this. It's not a whim. It's the only way to stop another generation of bloodshed." Davos said softly. "But be ready for a fight, peaceful or otherwise." The next morning, the assembled lords were supposed to continue their discussions in the Hall of the Crown, but rumors spread that Lord Lannister and a handful of others were meeting in a secret gathering in the city. Gendry dispatched discreet members of the City Watch to monitor the situation. By midday, word reached him that a group of 20 or so armed men had been seen leaving the manse where Lord Lannister lodged. The men had separated into smaller bands and vanished into different neighborhoods. A sense of dread stirred in Gendry. Were they planning an assassination or a show of force? He quickly arranged to bolster the Red Keep's guard, not wanting a repeat of the horrors that had once befallen kings who let their guard down. But by nightfall, no attempt on his life came. Instead, fires broke out in Flea Bottom. Shops were torched, and chaos spread as gangs of ruffians, likely paid by some lord, began terrorizing the small folk. Gendry received frantic reports of looting, of men wearing the sigils of the Westerlands leading attacks. He felt his blood boil. An attack on the common people was meant to instill fear and disrupt any support Gendry had among them. He wasted no time. He donned his old smith's leathers beneath a cloak, ignoring Brienne's protests that it was too dangerous. Gathering a contingent of gold cloaks, he ventured into the lower city. The night was alive with flames, the sky streaked red. Screams echoed in the alleys, and the stench of smoke burned Gendry's nostrils. He could hardly believe how quickly the city had been turned into a battlefield once more. In the thick of it, Gendry found pockets of armed thugs dragging families out of their homes. With a roar, he and the gold cloaks charged. Despite the swirling chaos, Gendry took the lead, his hammer, an old friend from years past, swinging in a deadly arc. He had always been strong, and the warhammer felt right in his grip, as if it reminded him that before he was a king, he was a man of the forge. The thugs scattered, some turning to fight. Steel clashed in the gloom, sparks flying like tiny fireflies. Gendry saw a man with a lion crest hack at a defenseless peasant, and he bellowed in rage, smashing the attacker with a sideways blow that sent him reeling into a wall. The gold cloaks fanned out, quelling the worst of the violence. Citizens emerged from hiding, some with clubs or knives, ready to defend themselves. Blood slicked the cobblestones. Gendry pressed on, fear for his own life drowned by fury at the injustice. He pushed through the narrow streets, where the heat of the fires made the air shimmer, and found more criminals huddled, seemingly preparing to unleash fresh mayhem. Gendry and his men surged forward, driving them back. By dawn, the fires had been largely contained, and the worst of the violence had subsided. Exhausted and covered in soot, Gendry returned to the Red Keep to discover that many of the lords had locked themselves in their chambers, terrified that the city had gone mad. Lord Lannister was nowhere to be found. He had fled. Gendry's rage only deepened. He convened an emergency session in the Hall of the Crown, summoning whomever would come. A few arrived sheepishly, bearing wide eyes at the king's disheveled state, the black smudges on his face, and the bloody cut on his forearm. "I stand before you not as a king who sits in luxury while his city burns," Gendry said, his voice echoing across the silence. "I stood in the streets, hammer in hand, to protect my people. To protect your people. Lord Lannister, or those under his command, attacked innocent lives to sow fear and chaos. I will not stand for it." A trembling minor lord rose, voice quavering. "What will you do, your grace? If Lannister has fled, how do we even begin to address?" "He has named himself an enemy of the crown," Gendry answered. "His open rebellion proves the point of everything I've said. The old houses will gladly spill innocent blood to preserve their own power. Let it be known that if Lord Lannister does not surrender, if he continues to perpetrate violence, I will treat him as I would treat any criminal. And if any lord here stands with him, I will consider you likewise complicit." The hall was silent. They could see in Gendry's eyes that he meant every word. No idle threats lingered there. Only the hard resolve of a man who had grown up in the gutter and knew violence as an ugly fact of life. He would not be cowed by the wealth or name of a Lannister. Over the next few days, an uneasy calm settled on King's Landing. The small folk, grateful that Gendry and the gold cloaks had come to their defense, began to chant his name in the streets, calling him the people's king. Meanwhile, the lords who remained tried to negotiate, to find some middle ground. They asked Gendry if they could keep their lands in name only, or if they could be recognized as hereditary governors. But Gendry refused to yield on the core principle. No more inherited titles of nobility, no more feudal subjugation. The realm would transition to a new system or not at all. Word reached them that Lord Lannister had fled to Casterly Rock, gathering whatever loyal forces he could muster. Reports indicated he was forging alliances with other houses that stood to lose power under Gendry's plan. The storm of conflict loomed on the horizon. Gendry called for ravens to be sent across the realm, announcing that any who joined Lannister's rebellion would face the full might of the crown. He also implored the small folk in every region to stand firm, to recognize that this war would be fought in their name. He promised that once the dust settled, they would no longer be beholden to the whims of lords. Skepticism and hope mingled in equal measure across the Seven Kingdoms. Sansa Stark arrived from Winterfell, traveling incognito for safety. She met Gendry in private, urging caution. He respected her keen mind and her sense of duty to her people. She explained that many Northerners were wary of more southern wars, that they had already lost so much. But there was also a spark of promise in her eyes. She, too, had seen how the old system had failed time and time again. She did not fully endorse Gendry's plan, but she did not reject it either. She offered to stand as a neutral mediator, hoping to keep the realm from descending into another bloodbath. Gendry was grateful for her counsel, and for Brienne's unwavering support. Gradually, a sense of coalition formed. Some smaller lords, some merchant houses, the new moneyed class that had emerged in the chaos of the wars. And the entire city of King's Landing seemed to gravitate toward Gendry's side. Meanwhile, the staunch traditionalists, led by House Lannister and a handful of other proud families, gathered in the Westerlands, forging an alliance that threatened open conflict. In Flea Bottom, Gendry began to hold open-air gatherings, letting the people see their king up close. He spoke frankly of his plan, describing how councils would be formed, how taxes would be used to support public works, how the king's peace would protect everyone equally. He listened to the people's concerns, fears that new taxes might crush them, that local power brokers might step in to replace the lords, or that bandits might run rampant. Gendry promised that the crown would maintain an army and a watchful eye, but that army would not be made of levies forced by lords. Instead, it would be a volunteer force, paid and trained by the crown, loyal not to any single house but to the realm as a whole. It was an ambitious plan, and Gendry knew the risks of making promises that he might not be able to fulfill. Still, the alternative, maintaining the old feudal order, was unacceptable to him. Each day, he rose with a sense of purpose he had never known, as though he were hammering at the greatest sword the realm had ever seen, forging it from the raw metal of centuries of oppression and cruelty. The first blows of war fell when Lord Lannister marched on the crown's holdfast at Golden Grove in the Reach. The small garrison there had been loyal to Gendry, and though outnumbered, they fought bravely. Word reached King's Landing that the holdfast had fallen, its defenders slaughtered. Lord Lannister declared the crown's soldiers traitors to the rightful nobility of Westeros. In response, Gendry called for the newly assembled royal army to march west. He personally led them, determined not to remain idle in the Red Keep while his men fought and died. The days leading up to the battle were grueling. Gendry insisted on marching with the foot soldiers, refusing to ride a litter or even a lavish horse. He walked among them, speaking with them as a fellow fighter. He recalled his time marching with the Brotherhood without banners, with Sir Beric and Thoros of Myre. Though they were outlaws, they had believed in protecting the small folk. Now Gendry saw that same spirit reflected in many of these new soldiers who volunteered for the crown's cause, seeking a better world than the one they had known. When they reached the field near the ruins of Golden Grove, Lannister's forces arrayed themselves in gleaming lines of crimson and gold. At their flank stood contingents from other rebellious houses. Gendry's army, by contrast, was a patchwork of city recruits, mercenaries who had pledged to fight for the crown, and a smattering of loyal knights. But they were united by the promise of a new age. As they faced each other on the field, Gendry could sense the trepidation pulsing in the air. The battle began with the thunder of cavalry charges. Gendry stayed in the thick of it, warhammer in hand, wearing the black stag sigil on his breastplate. He felt no exhilaration, only a grim determination. He did not want this war, but he had come too far to yield. If the dream of a free Westeros were to survive, he had to fight now. The roars of men, the clash of steel, the screams of the dying, it all merged into a horrifying symphony. In the chaos, Gendry found himself face to face with a knight bearing the Lannister sigil. The man swung a longsword, the blade whistling past Gendry's helm. Gendry countered with a brutal upswing of his hammer. The knight's guard broke, and Gendry knocked him to the ground. He heard the dull crunch of armor, and then he moved on. The battle raged for what felt like hours under a blazing sun. Dust and blood caked the air. When the horns finally sounded, Gendry's forces emerged victorious, though at a terrible cost. The field was littered with bodies, the dead and the dying. Lannister's men retreated, carrying away their wounded and leaving behind their fallen. Gendry stood among the carnage, shoulders sagging with fatigue. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the responsibility he bore. Another victory, perhaps, but also another scar upon the realm. He looked around for Davos and Brienne, eventually finding them. Both bore cuts and bruises, but they were alive, relief etched into their faces. They had survived another test. In the days after the battle, letters poured in from across the realm. Some lords, witnessing Lannister's defeat, began to waver in their commitment to the rebellion. Others, emboldened by the bloodshed, doubled down, determined to stand against what they saw as Gendry's tyranny against the nobility. Still, Gendry refused to relinquish his vision. Every step forward was paid for in the blood of soldiers and small folk, but he pushed on. He led the army westward, determined to reach Casterly Rock and force a final confrontation. Along the way, villages welcomed him with mixed emotions. Gratitude for the possibility of liberation, fear of the retribution from rebel forces. Gendry instructed his men to treat the locals with respect, to pay for supplies, to show them that this new royal army was unlike the ravaging hordes of the past. Small acts of mercy and kindness began to win hearts. Where once men had spat at the mention of the crown, they now offered small tokens of gratitude, or at least withheld their scorn. Meanwhile, Lord Lannister retreated into his fortress, the legendary Casterly Rock, with high walls and deep tunnels carved into the rock face. He expected a siege, and he had the stores to withstand one for months, if not years. Gendry's strategy, however, was not simply to starve the lion out. He knew that behind the walls of Casterly Rock, Lannister's hold on his own people might be more tenuous than it seemed. Enlisting the help of local miners and smugglers, Gendry discovered hidden passages, ways to breach the outskirts of the fortress. Davos coordinated small infiltration teams at night, while the main army camped outside in plain sight. When the moment came, Gendry launched a calculated strike. While the majority of his forces arrayed themselves in a diversionary assault on the main gate, smaller squads slipped into the passages. The fighting inside the tunnels was cramped and brutal, but the infiltration teams managed to open the postern gates. Soon, Gendry's men poured into the courtyard, surprising the defenders. Clashes broke out along the ramparts. Lannister's forces fought valiantly, but they were outmaneuvered, caught between the external siege and the internal infiltration. Gendry himself led a squad into the central keep, where he found Lord Lannister, a man in lavish crimson robes, a gilded sword at his hip, attempting to rally his remaining knights. The moment Lannister saw Gendry, a sneer curled his lips. "You would burn down the pillars of Westeros for your mad dream," Lannister spat. "You are no king. You are a blacksmith wearing a stolen crown." Gendry raised his hammer, breathing heavily from the exertion of the day. "This ends now," he said. "Lay down your arms, surrender, and stand trial. Enough blood has been spilled." "Manner." Lannister's eyes flicked with defiance. "I will not bend the knee to a bastard." The fight was swift and vicious. Lannister's knights attacked. Gendry met them with the fury of a man who had survived countless hardships. He parried a sword thrust with the haft of his hammer, then caught the knight with a crushing blow to the chest. Sparks flew as steel met steel. Brienne burst in through a side door, her armor dented and scratched, her sword slicing through another knight. Gendry advanced on Lannister, who slashed wildly. Gendry blocked, hammered, and pinned the lord against a marble pillar. The gleaming sword clattered to the floor. Lannister's eyes blazed with hatred, but he was at Gendry's mercy. "Go on and kill me, you traitor," Lannister hissed. "Prove to the realm you're no better than the rest." A silence hung in the air. Gendry had only to bring down his hammer, and it would be over. But he remembered his vow. He would not be the kind of king who executed without justice. He stepped back, letting Brienne's sword press against the Lord's throat. "You will stand trial," he said. "There will be no more killings for pride." The aftermath of that final confrontation was staggering. With Casterly Rock in Gendry's hands, much of the rebellion collapsed. The lords who remained loyal to Lannister tried to flee or negotiate. Gendry allowed them terms if they would submit to the new order, give up their titles, and pledge themselves to the Charter of Common Freedoms. Some balked, but with the largest fortress in the Westerlands lost, their position was hopeless. Over weeks and months, the rebellion sputtered out, though isolated clashes persisted like embers in a dying fire. Back in King's Landing, Lord Lannister was tried before a tribunal comprised not of hand-picked lords, but of respected knights, maesters, and even common-born representatives. They laid out the charges: conspiracy against the crown, murder of small folk, incitement of war. Lannister refused to plead for mercy, instead ranting about the destruction of noble traditions. The tribunal found him guilty. Gendry, in a final act of symbolic justice, commuted the death sentence to life in prison, where Lannister would labor for the realm like any other criminal. And then began the real work. The Charter of Common Freedoms was put into effect across Westeros. It was not a swift or simple process. Some lords resisted quietly, dragging their feet. Others accepted new roles as elected officials or counselors. Sansa Stark oversaw the transition in the north, ensuring that old feuds did not erupt anew. The Vale set up a council of knights and commoners, each region struggling in its own way to learn how to govern without the old chain of feudal loyalty. The challenges were immense. There were arguments about boundaries, about how to choose representatives, about the rights of small folk who worked land owned by a lord for generations. But for the first time in living memory, the conversation was about how to include the small folk, how to treat them as equals under the law. In King's Landing, Gendry presided over the new Crown Council. Davos served as Hand of the King, bringing his honesty and practical wisdom. Brienne commanded the King's Guard, though it was now less a ceremonial guard for a single ruler, and more a dedicated protector's order for any official threatened by violence. Podrick, though ill-suited to politics, remained a steadfast presence, quietly ensuring Gendry's safety. Edric Storm took on the role of Master of Laws, working with maesters to craft the new statutes. The city's thousands of inhabitants cautiously adapted, finding small freedoms and new responsibilities. Over time, the climate of fear began to ease, replaced by a curious excitement. Beyond the capital, roads were repaired, markets opened, and trade blossomed. The Crown's new policies supported blacksmiths, farmers, and craftsmen, recognizing that a realm's strength lay in the productivity of its people, not in the vanity of its lords. Grain stores were established to buffer against harsh winters or droughts, a measure that impressed even the skeptical lords. Slowly, it became clear that the blacksmith king's dream was not mere rhetoric. Of course, it was far from a utopia. Banditry still existed. Local power-mongers still exploited the weak. But now, justice was less likely to be skewed by the influence of a single lord's goal. Councils were formed to hear cases, with representatives from various walks of life. In some regions, old families managed to cling to power under new titles, but they could no longer take their rights for granted. They were answerable to a broader structure, one that demanded accountability. Gendry traveled often, refusing to remain cloistered in the Red Keep. He journeyed to the Reach to see the farmland distribution. He went to the Riverlands, hearing from commoners who had endured the horrors of war for far too long. In the north, he knelt in the godswood of Winterfell with Sansa, paying respects to the old gods, honoring the memory of those lost in the wars and the long night. The common folk greeted him not with the forced deference once demanded by kings, but with cautious optimism and, over time, genuine gratitude. As the years passed, Gendry oversaw the steady dismantling of the last vestiges of noble dominion. Castles once held by great houses were converted into administrative centers, schools or barracks for the new royal army. Land charters were redrawn so that families who had worked certain fields for generations were recognized as rightful stewards, with the freedom to buy, sell, or bequeath property without a lord's interference. Titles such as Lord Paramount or Warden of the North vanished from official records, replaced by the concept of regional council heads, who served limited terms. Children from all backgrounds began to receive basic education in reading, writing, and sums, funded in part by the crown's taxation of trade routes. Maesters traveled more freely, establishing small outposts to care for the sick and to teach. This newfound spread of knowledge further eroded the power once held exclusively by the nobility. The words of the charter, "All men and women of Westeros, high-born or small folk, share in the realm's freedoms and responsibilities," were engraved on monuments in each major city, a physical reminder that the old ways were gone. Naturally, it wasn't an uncontested transformation. Some old families plotted in secret, biding their time for a chance to restore the feudal order. Rumors of conspiracies against King Gendry and his council surfaced intermittently, but these were dealt with by the watchful eyes of Brienne and the newly established investigative arm of the crown, an organization that strove to uphold laws without fear or favor. Trials were conducted publicly, with the people allowed to witness. Most conspiracies fizzled out, as the majority of the populace had little desire to return to the oppression of the old system. Over time, even the most stubborn pockets of resistance diminished. Through it all, Gendry never forgot where he came from. He spent time in the forges, sometimes assisting smiths in forging swords or plows. Though he was king, he insisted on retaining the rough humility that had defined him. He never wanted to lose sight of the people he aimed to serve. Walking through markets, he would speak with bakers, carpenters, even beggars, trying to understand the daily struggles that could not be glimpsed from a distant throne. In time, the story of the blacksmith king spread beyond Westeros, piquing curiosity in the free cities. Envoys from Braavos, Pentos, Volantis, and beyond arrived to see if the new order was as stable and prosperous as rumors claimed. Trade agreements flourished, though some foreign merchants were wary of a realm that seemed to have cast aside its nobility. Gendry welcomed them openly, knowing that the realm's prosperity depended on forging relationships across the narrow sea. He sometimes wondered about Arya Stark, sailing on her voyages, charting unknown lands. Perhaps she would return one day to find a Westeros transformed. He hoped she would approve of what he had done, how he had tried to break the cycle of oppression that had ensnared so many. He thought often of Jon Snow, too, exiled in the far north, or Daenerys Targaryen, whose dream of breaking the wheel had ultimately consumed her. He wished they could see that their sacrifices had paved the way for a realm that might finally know peace. On the 5th anniversary of the Charter of Common Freedoms, a grand gathering was held in King's Landing, though it was nothing like the decadent feasts of the past. Delegates from each region came to report on progress and setbacks. There was debate, tension, the inevitable clash of opinions. But at the center of it was a shared belief that Westeros could be a realm of laws, not a realm of lords. Gendry sat in the chair at the head of the hall, not the Iron Throne, which stood unused as a relic in a side chamber. He listened more than he spoke. He let the delegates speak, trusting in the process. When he finally did rise, the hall fell silent, waiting for their king's word. He looked out at the crowd, people of different backgrounds, some with fine clothes, others with threadbare tunics, but all with a voice. It filled him with a sense of awe and humility. "This is what we fought for," he said, his voice firm but warm. "A realm where our differences and disagreements can be settled not by swords in the dark, but by open discussion and fair-minded compromise. A realm where no one is above the law, and all are free to live, to work, and to raise their children in peace." A gentle applause rippled through the hall, a far cry from the roars of triumph that once accompanied the crowning of kings, but it felt more genuine to Gendry. For a moment he allowed himself to think of his old life, a bastard boy in Flea Bottom, heating metal in a dim forge. How unlikely his journey had been. He had stumbled into power almost by accident, recognized as Robert Baratheon's bastard, crowned by a desperate council. Yet from that chance beginning, he had used the Iron Throne not to glorify himself, but to dismantle the very institution that had placed him there. He knew it was not the end of conflict. Human nature did not change in a single generation. Ambition, greed, and cruelty would always exist. But the structures that enabled them to flourish had been challenged, if not toppled. For the first time in 1,000 years, Westeros was being shaped by the hands of its people, not by the decrees of birthright lords. And that was a reason to hope. Years passed, and the transformation continued. Children grew up never knowing the fear of a highborn lord's whim. Education spread, farmland was tended by those who owned it, and the roads between cities thrived with trade. The memory of the old feudal houses did not vanish entirely. Some still clung to their surnames with a sense of nostalgia, and castles still towered above towns as historical landmarks. But the notion that any one house had the right to rule over the others by blood alone was fading into myth. Gendry himself, now well into his middle years, walked the streets of King's Landing with less of the old strength in his legs, but still a steady determination in his step. He paused to watch a group of children playing a game, chasing each other with wooden swords. One child pretended to be the evil lord, another the blacksmith king. The rest took the roles of the people, rallying around the king to topple the tyrant with laughter and cheers. Gendry smiled faintly, amused that his story had been woven into children's games. He did not need a statue or a song to mark his reign. This was enough. He carried with him a small ledger, a habit formed over the years. In its pages were notes about current issues facing each region, details about shipments of grain, proposals for new laws to regulate commerce. He added a line now and then, mindful that governance was an ongoing process, one that required constant attention. Some men had told him a king's life should be one of luxury and delegation. But Gendry could never be that kind of king. A blacksmith does not shy away from the heat of the forge. He stands close to the flame, shaping metal with hammer and sweat. At the Red Keep, now partly repurposed into administrative offices, he gathered with his council, a diverse group that included merchants, knights, former lords, maesters, and even a common-born woman who had proven herself a skilled negotiator. Together, they tackled a new challenge: the North's concerns about harsh winters, the Reach request for improved irrigation, the Stormland's need for better roads. They debated taxation policies, the roles of local councils, and how to ensure fairness without crushing ambition or innovation. It was a careful balancing act, but one performed in the sunlight of transparency, not in the shadows of old feuds. At one point in the meeting, the conversation paused, and Davos, still sharp though his hair had turned white, looked at Gendry with a warm smile. "I never thought I'd see the day when half the realm's disputes could be sorted out in a single room, without swords," he said. "We've come a long way, lad." Gendry inclined his head. "We have you to thank for much of it, Sir Davos. Without your counsel, I would have stumbled blind." Davos waved a hand. "I just gave advice. You had the heart for it." He leaned back. "There will be more trials ahead. There always are. But we've given the people a voice. That was the key." When the meeting concluded, Gendry walked out onto a balcony overlooking the city. The sun dipped low, casting the rooftops in a warm, golden glow. King's Landing no longer smelled quite as foul as it once did. Under the new order, better sewers and sanitation had been introduced. Growth had led to improvements in every aspect of life. He could see the winding Blackwater rush, see the ships in the bay carrying goods from Dorne to the north. He thought of how Robert Baratheon's war had started with a rebellion that enthroned him, yet ultimately changed little for the common folk. Now Gendry's own rebellion, if one could call it that, had started with a crown forced upon him and had ended in the dissolution of the entire feudal system. He heard a flutter of wings and saw a raven take flight from a nearby perch, carrying a message northward. Perhaps it bore news of a new settlement or a dispute to be resolved. Perhaps it carried a letter from some distant traveler who roamed uncharted lands. Life would go on with or without a king, and Gendry found comfort in that. He did not see himself as indispensable. Indeed, he believed that the realm he had helped shape would not collapse if he fell in battle, or died of an illness. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift he could give Westeros. A system that did not hinge on one man's life or one house's power. He leaned against the stone railing, letting the breeze brush his face. In the distance, a group of orphans played near the city gates. One child had a toy hammer, swinging it gleefully, as if he too might forge a brighter future. Gendry smiled, remembering how it felt to hold a hammer for the first time, the thrill and possibility that came with shaping metal into something strong and purposeful. A gentle knock sounded behind him, and Brienne stepped onto the balcony. She had remained steadfast all these years, serving the realm with the same sense of honor that once drove her to protect the Stark girls. "Your Grace," she said softly, "it's nearly dusk." He nodded. "Thank you, Sir Brienne. I'll be in soon." She lingered for a moment, following his gaze over the city. "We did the right thing," she said. "I wasn't sure at first, but I see it now, in the streets, in the faces of the people. The realm is better off." He reached out and gently squeezed her armored forearm. "We did it together. None of this would have been possible if the good people of Westeros hadn't stood with us." They stood in companionable silence, watching as lanterns and torches lit the twilight streets below. The city seemed at peace, or as close to peace as it ever could be. Gendry closed his eyes, letting a sense of calm wash over him. He thought of the wars behind them, the screams and fires, the betrayals and heartbreak. He thought of the old houses, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Lannister, and how their histories had shaped the realm. He thought of the new generation of children growing up free from those ancient yokes, their futures unwritten. He opened his eyes, glancing one last time at the battered iron throne that loomed in a side chamber, unused. It stood as a relic, a reminder of the cruelty and ambition that had once consumed so many lives. Yet now it was only that, a relic. The real seat of power was the table where delegates gathered, where laws were crafted, where voices were heard. Gendry turned away from the old throne, letting the memory fade. There was still so much to do, so much to build. The forging of a just realm was an endless task, but it was one he embraced with all his heart. With a final look at the city he loved, Gendry Baratheon stepped back inside the Red Keep, ready to meet with his council once more, to guide and be guided, to serve rather than to rule. And so his reign continued, not as an age of kings, but as the beginning of a new era in which the people themselves carried the torch of freedom, their voices and hopes forging the destiny of Westeros, once and for all.